Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about America on the world stage, and today we are talking about politics and regional interests plus the American system. This is going to be a doozy, okay? So buckle in if you're ready. Let's begin. First thing we need to understand is this new vocab word called sectionalism. So, what sectionalism means is that basically the North and the South are going to be more separate from each other and they're going to be more entrenched in their own economies. They're going to be focused on themselves and the West as well to a little bit of a lesser extent. Okay. So, the South is going to be focused on farming, making cotton, growing tobacco, agriculture. That's what the South is all about. And the North is manufacturing, factories, banking, shipping, trade. Okay. So the South is growing products, the North is making stuff out of those products. Both these regions are trading their goods to distant markets of Europe. And both these regions rely on each other, right? Because if the North is creating clothes in their factories, well, they need Southern cotton to do it. All right. So, but they're growing more sectional, meaning they're growing more separate from each other throughout the 1800s. Now, politics wise, we're going to get a time period called the Era of Good Feelings that takes place from Thomas Jefferson all the way to James Monroe. So, Thomas Jefferson is the third president, James Monroe is the fifth president. And they're all the same political party. They're all the Democratic Republicans. This is 25 years of one party in charge of America. In fact, the Federalists start to not even run candidates, and they have a big issue after the Hartford Convention. Remember from the War of 1812, that causes them to stop existing at all. So political infighting ends. Things seem to be following George Washington's farewell address advice. America, wins the War of 1812. Things seem to be going really well politically. We're not having a lot of disputes. Well, here's something that happens. It's called the corrupt bargain. Very important to know this because it's going to kind of spawn the rest of what we're going to talk about today. So, we get an election in 1824. A Federalist doesn't even run. There's no Federalist. It's just four different Democratic Republicans running against each other. And it is a very close election. Now, as I said, there's four different people running. Andrew Jackson wins this election. He gets the most electoral votes. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, right, the second president, he gets the second most votes. Andrew Jackson is famous from the War of 1812. If you remember, he was the guy who helped them win the Battle of New Orleans. So Andrew Jackson wins. Okay, no problem. Democratic Republican wins. Except there's an issue. There's a problem. Jackson only got 43% of the vote. And if a president doesn't get 50% of the electoral votes, the House of Representatives gets to choose the president. And this is where we get the corrupt bargain. So, the corrupt bargain is basically a backroom deal that gets made to put John Quincy Adams as president from 1824, even though he came in second. So there's this guy, Henry Clay, who we're going to talk about later. He comes in fourth in the election, and he absolutely despises Andrew Jackson, the guy who came in first. And so what Henry Clay does is he says, hey, John Quincy Adams, what if I give you all of my votes? What if we form an alliance together? And in return, John Quincy Adams is going to make Henry Clay the Secretary of State. So this makes John Quincy Adams the winner in 1824. And people who like Andrew Jackson, and remember, this is about 43% of the country, are very, very angry at this. That's why they call it the corrupt bargain. Even though this is the process outlined in the Constitution that the House gets to choose, Andrew Jackson feels like he's been wronged, basically, is what he feels like. Okay, so this is a big turning point, and this is how we're going to start to see new political parties form. So after John Quincy Adams president in the election of 1824, the next president, you guessed it, Andrew Jackson. He is our 7th president, and he is president from 1829 to 1837. Now, he is a Democrat. We've not heard that word before, right? That party is new. We've heard about the Democratic Republicans. That was the party of John Quincy Adams and Thomas Jefferson, right? We've heard about that. But we got a new party now, just the Democratic Party, okay? He founds this party after the corrupt bargain. This ends the era of good feelings. We now have political infighting again, and it starts the movement towards bigger political parties, towards two different political parties, which we see today. Now, something Andrew Jackson's going to do is that's on a positive. He's going to expand voting rights. Now, not to everybody. Black people started getting their voting rights. Women still aren't, but he lets all white men vote. Before this, it was just white men who owned land, so that's a positive from Andrew Jackson. Another important thing that Andrew Jackson does while president is he introduces what's called the spoils system. Now, the spoils system is where he gives his supporters jobs in the government, even if they weren't very good at their jobs. Basically, you backed me, I'm going to hook you up later with a job. Now, in general, and we're going to talk more about Andrew Jackson throughout this lesson, he is a very controversial president, okay? He starts out as like a big central government guy, in favor of having a big federal government. And a lot of people hate him for that. He does move more towards state rights after a while, but he's a very important person to know about, and we're going to continue talking about him as we go on in this lesson. Now, to kind of take a break from politics in a little bit of a sense, I want to talk about the region of politics here, okay? So at this time, remember, we talked about sectionalism earlier. Regional interests are going to trump the national concern. So many people start to focus on issues like slavery and economics as they are thought about in their own state, in their own area, as opposed to how they're thought about in the entire country. And one example of this is the nullification crisis in 1833. Okay, so South Carolina and other states are going to oppose something that Andrew Jackson is going to do. He's going to create these tariffs. Remember, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. So Andrew Jackson creates these tariffs, the tariffs of 1828 and the tariffs of 1832. And South Carolina does something called nullify those tariffs, meaning we're just not going to follow them. We're going to nullify them, don't care, not following them. Okay, and this is led by this guy, John C. Calhoun, who you see pictured on the right. Now, South Carolina even threatens to secede. They say, we will be our own country if you come in, Andrew Jackson, and you try to collect this tariff by force. So, if you're thinking long term, when we eventually get to the Civil War, nullification crisis is a great piece of context to show how South Carolina is not going to be okay with the federal government making big, claims or kind of what they would see as overstepping their boundaries. Now, they don't actually secede. This gets solved by a compromise so that everyone can save face. But it's a pretty big issue where, again, we see Andrew Jackson trying to use the power of the government to impose these tariffs, and South Carolina saying we don't want to. It's going to hurt where we are. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, why it would hurt South Carolina. But in general, like we've talked about the importance of regional politics, one of the biggest issues is slavery. And as the 1800s goes on, and we'll talk about this all unit, the South becomes more entrenched in slavery, meaning slavery becomes more and more vital to their economy, and they become more about slavery, whereas the northern states start to outlaw the slavery. Now, that should make sense to you because in the South, what's their industry? Agriculture. Right? That's where slaves are often going to be working. Whereas in the North, it's in factories where slaves are not going to be able to work as easily if you're not going to educate them. So, for example, like New York, they make slavery illegal in 1827. So that's just an example of how the northern states start to outlaw slavery. Okay, so the next topic that we need to talk about is something called the American system. And it's essentially the beginning of a second political party that's going to try to compete with Andrew Jackson's Democrats. And who creates his political party? No other than Henry Clay, the guy who hated Andrew Jackson in the very beginning and started that whole corrupt bargain business. Okay, so Henry Clay, pictured on the right. He's got some ideas for how to fix America. Now, why does America need fixing? Let's talk background info, historical context. During the early 1800s, the country is going to face a lot of challenges. One, our industries, especially in the North, are having a hard time competing with British industries because Britain is so much more established with the Industrial Revolution. Two, our infrastructure is weak. Our roads, our bridges, how we're navigating rivers, those are very weak, especially in the West. And at this time, the West is thought of as like Kentucky and Ohio and Tennessee. So we need to be building more infrastructure. Last issue is the Bank of the United States, also called the BUS. When you see BUS, think Bank of the United States. So remember, the Bank of the United States is like the federal bank that issues money to the national government, prints our money, right? So the first Bank of the United States expired because it only lasted for so long. They made a second Bank of the United States. It was rechartered in 1816 for 20 years, but when it comes up again for the third one, there's going to be a lot of fighting over whether or not we should have the Bank of the United States. And so the American system, that's Henry Clay's attempts to address these issues of industry, of infrastructure, and of trying to get the bank, to keep on going. So Henry Clay is important to know his American system. We're going to keep talking about it. So the American system has some successes, okay? In the North, in the Midwest, they get more closely linked through the building of these infrastructure plans that Henry Clay talks about and that the Whigs talk about. And American industries are able to prosper. So we see some industries are located in the North. So we see some success in the North and the West. But there are also some failures, right? All areas of the US are not unified, especially in the South. They are sort of feel left out of the American system. And as a result, we see sectionalism increase, where people are more thought of their own region as opposed to the country as their whole. Example of that is the nullification crisis. Okay. And we're going to continue to see debates about how big should the federal government be and should the government be involved in intra-state business, business between and within a state. So as we mentioned before, when Henry Clay creates the Whig Party, he's going to basically go up against Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party, and this creates the second party system. And this is beginning in the 1820s to 1830s, and we're going to see Whigs and Democrats go against each other for a number of years up until the Civil War. And we need to know the differences between the parties. We're going to talk about four areas: the role and power of the federal government, the national bank, tariffs, and federally funded internal improvements. We're going to break each one of those down now. So, the role and power of the federal government. What does each party believe in? The Whigs want a stronger central government, and the Democrats want more power to the states. Now, again, this is in general because sometimes they're going to go against these ideas, but in general, that's what they believe. As far as the national banks go, the Whigs like the Bank of the United States. That should make sense because the Bank of the United States is a strong central government idea. And they think that they need to do this because they think Andrew Jackson is taking too much power, that he's not paying attention to the Constitution, that he's vetoing too many bills. If you see, this is a very famous political cartoon on the right. The Whigs make Andrew Jackson look like he's a king, like he's the king of England. He's vetoing bills, meaning he's not signing the bills that Congress gives him. He's stepping all over the Constitution. We'll talk about he's not allowing internal improvements. We'll talk about how he doesn't give Native Americans their rights. He doesn't listen to the judicial branch. So they're really against Andrew Jackson. They think he's too powerful. Even though the Whigs say they want a strong central government, they think Andrew Jackson's taken it too far. Okay. And the Democrats, remember, they oppose the Bank of the United States. Jackson actually vetoes the third iteration of the Bank of the United States in 1832. Jackson hates the Bank of the United States. He thinks that it causes too many financial issues. There was like a financial panic, which is kind of like a financial depression when he was president, that he blames the bank for. And he thinks that the bank is just bringing too much money into politics, so he doesn't like it. Last two issues we want to talk about between between the Whigs and the Democrats. Tariffs is one of them. So remember, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. Now, who is this going to favor? It's going to favor the people in the North because in the North we have factories. And if we have factories in the North, Tariffs are going to encourage people to buy American-made products because they're going to make external products more expensive. So it should make sense to you that the Whigs support tariffs and the Democrats oppose them because the Whigs are from the North and the Democrats are from the South. Last idea here is federally funded internal improvements. So, should the government be building roads and improvements, bridges, that kind of thing? Well, the Whigs, again, they want them to do this because the Whigs are in favor of a stronger central government, and the Democrats and Andrew Jackson's party are against it. For example, there is a discussion to build a road called Maysville Road. You see a sign pictured on the right. There's a plan to build it. And in the beginning, the road would only be in one state, in Kentucky. Okay. And Andrew Jackson says, veto, I'm not going to give you any federal government money to build this road because it's only improving one state, and that's an intra state improvement. We shouldn't be funding it. So there's their differences on that. Now, that's it for the Whigs and the Democrats, but I need to talk about a few more issues that are going on in this time period. I know there's a lot here. It's okay. You'll be able to do it. So, this is a very important issue that relates to slavery. It's called the Missouri Compromise. Now, this is very important, so make sure we're slowing down. We understand this, okay? There's a little bit of background here. At the time of the Missouri Compromise, which is pictured on the right, the number of states in America was 22. And we had 11 states, all in the North, who were free, and 11 states, all in the South, that had slaves. So we had a perfect balance. And that was good to many people in America because they thought that that created balance in the government. One group, the slavery supporters or the freedom supporters, wouldn't have too much power in the government because remember, every state has 2 senators and House of Representatives, right? So it created a balance. But Missouri, who you see pictured in the map, MO, they want to become a state. We purchased Louisiana Territory, right? Remember, Thomas Jefferson purchased it, and they want to become a state. But whatever they become a state as, slave or free, and they want to become a slave state, it's going to upset the balance of free and slave states. And so, what the Missouri Compromise does is we'll talk about in a little bit, but this is kind of the issue that's happening right now. Okay, there is relating to slavery at this time. There's something called the Talmadge Amendment, which basically is trying to solve this slavery problem for the whole country. It basically says that children of slaves would become free once they were 25 years old. Now, the House of Representatives liked it, but the Senate rejected it, and it never happens. But the Talmadge Amendment is a good early thing to think about to show this tension over slavery, how we're trying to solve the problem of slavery. We're trying to figure out how to create freedom for slaves in America, but we're not able to. And that's why we have to have these compromises like the Missouri Compromise. So, how is Missouri going to get into the Union? What are we going to do? Henry Clay comes in, and a nickname for Henry Clay is the Great Negotiator, the Great Compromiser. Okay, Henry Clay is often trying to find ways to unite the North and the South. And he comes up with the Missouri Compromise, and there are 3 parts to it that we need to know. 1, Missouri is a slave state. All right, Missouri, you get to be a slave state. 2, Maine becomes a state. If you remember from the 13 colonies, Maine never existed, and like Massachusetts owned all that land up there in the northeast part of America. Well, now they're going to break it up, and Maine gets to be a state. They're going to come in as free. Why is that important? It keeps the balance of slave and free states. And they're going to try to say, Henry Clay's like, okay, I don't want to keep having to make discussions and decisions about whether states are slave or free. So we're going to make a line. It's called the 3630 Missouri Compromise line. That's a line of latitude. And you can see it pictured on the map there, right north of Arkansas Territory and south of Missouri. And what it does is it says that any new state north of that line is going to be free, and any state south of that line would be slave. That's their plan. Okay, that's the plan. The impacts of this Missouri Compromise are important to know, right? The balance of slave and free states is the same: 12 free, 12 slave. For a while, the Missouri Compromise is going to eliminate these debates about new states and whether or not slavery should be in those new areas because they're going to alternate slave and free states, and they have that Missouri Compromise line to use. It's going to last for 34 years, which is a decent compromise in terms of slavery. But over time, we're going to see that slavery is going to become the number one issue in the United States because we're going to continue to expand west. And every time a new state comes in, They have to decide slave or free. That's a huge thing that's going to cause America a lot of trouble for the next 50, 60, 70 years is slavery. Okay. When a new state comes in, is it going to be slave or free? So there's going to be tons of new compromises and court cases that we're going to discuss. A lot of the next 2 units is about this issue of slavery and how America is trying to deal with it, because it is a significant issue that America needs to sort out. All right, we're almost there. We have only 3 more things to talk about before the big ideas. I know this is long. All right, here we go. Native Americans. We need to talk about Native Americans because as America starts to push west, there's conflicts that come up with the settlers and with Native Americans, right? People are living in these areas in Louisiana Purchase. Native Americans are there, but Americans feel like they should get to live there because their government just bought the land. So how do we settle these conflicts, okay? Well, here's one example of a conflict in 1832. It's called the Black Hawk War. The United States is going to attack Native Americans, convinced that these natives are hostile. And Black Hawk, he's a leader of this group of Native Americans. Him and his followers are defeated. And they are basically, when they're defeated, this is going to encourage a lot of Americans to move west of the Mississippi River. And a lot of people like Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis and Zachary Taylor, who are going to be future leaders in America, are going to actually serve in this conflict. And so this is an example of how we see this tension between American settlers and Native Americans in these areas. So because we have all this tension, we need to kind of discuss what to do with some Native Americans in America. And there's some issues with some Native Americans in Georgia and what will later be Florida. So this is an issue called the Indian Removal Act from 1830. This takes place under Andrew Jackson and it continues under the next president, Martin Van Buren. So the Indian Removal Act is a law that in Georgia that requires all members of the Cherokee Nation, all these Native Americans living there, to get out of the state and move west of the Mississippi River. They have to leave their historic homeland, their native homeland. Now, the Cherokee do something interesting. Instead of fighting, like we've seen a lot, and the Native Americans are continuing to lose these fights, they say, well, you know what? If we want to play by your rules, I'm going to sue. So the Cherokee Nation sues Georgia. They say, hey, we should not have to move. We were lived here first. Now, in this first case, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, this case actually gets thrown out because the Supreme Court says, natives, you're not even citizens, so you cannot sue. So they throw out the case. Okay, but they're not done. There's a second case. It's called Worcester versus Georgia. And Worcester is a U.S. citizen, and he sues, saying that the Native Americans should not have to leave. And here's what the Supreme Court decides. It's an interesting decision. They say the Native Americans do not have to move. They were there. They are allowed to stay. But Andrew Jackson does not agree. He's the president at this time. And even though the Supreme Court says that the Native Americans are allowed to stay in Georgia, he has this famous quote. John Marshall is the leader of the Supreme Court at the time. And he says, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. And what that means is the Supreme Court may make these decisions and say what laws are fair or not. But Andrew Jackson, the president, is the one with the army. And so they're the one who's going to decide. This is very controversial. This is a big takeover of power. Okay. So he's using powers that are nowhere in the Constitution. And he begins to start forcing Native Americans out of their land. And this is called the Trail of Tears, which actually takes place under the next president, Martin Van Buren, in 1838. But it's a continuation of policies from Andrew Jackson. And in 1838, the U.S. Army forces around 15,000 Native Americans to leave Georgia. It is a horrible, horrible event. They are forced to leave at gunpoint. 4,000 of these Native Americans die. So about 25% of them die on the journey. And they're forced to move into a reservation, which becomes current day Oklahoma. So this is a big black mark in U.S. history, a big issue in U.S. history because of this decision that Andrew Jackson makes to continue pushing them out, even though the Supreme Court says it's not allowed. You did it. Okay, we're done. So thank you so much. That's it for our notes on politics and regional interests and Andrew Jackson and federal power. That was a lot, but it was important. You all did a great job. I'm glad you're still with me. Let's do the big ideas. 1, describe the Whigs and the Democrats. What are their plans for the country? What are their pros and cons of each of those plans? Make sure you understand both of their ideas here. Thinking about Andrew Jackson, thinking about Henry Clay, the Democrats and the Whigs. Number two, why did the Missouri Compromise happen? And what's the impact of the Missouri Compromise? We've got to know the Missouri Compromise. It's going to come up again. Number three, how did the Democrats and Andrew Jackson deal with the Native Americans? What was their decision? How did they come to that decision? So thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.